They say the law came to Perry County, Kentucky on the back of a horse. But on a cold day in May of 1889, it died on the courthouse steps with a single rifle shot that echoed like a crack of doom. The man who fell was Judge Josiah Combs, a respected elder who believed the law was greater than any family's grudge. He was wrong. That single shot wasn't just a murder, it was the bloody climax of a war. How did a place like this descend into such savagery? What drove men to assassinate the very symbol of justice? Today, we trace the river of bad blood back to its source, to tell the ballad of the Perry County War. To understand the blood that was shed, you first have to understand the ground it soaked into. In the 1880s, Perry County wasn't just a place on a map. It was a world unto itself, walled in by the ancient, unblinking mountains of eastern Kentucky. The Kentucky River was its one slow artery to the outside, and news traveled up it on flatboats at a crawl. Life here was hard, carved out of the steep hillsides with an axe and a plow. A man's wealth was measured in the corn he grew, the hogs he raised, and the children who bore his name. In this isolation, a different kind of law took root. It wasn't written in any book, but every man, woman, and child knew it by heart. It was the mountain code. Family was everything. Your kin were your nation, your army, and your only true shield against a harsh world. An insult to your third cousin was an insult to you, and it had to be answered. A man's honor was his most sacred possession. It was a fragile thing, easily bruised by a stray word or a sideways glance, and once broken, it could only be mended with blood. The state government in Frankfurt was a distant rumor, and its laws were seen as suggestions at best, an unwelcome intrusion at worst. Justice was a personal matter, dispensed from the barrel of a Winchester rifle. Into this closed world, whispers of change began to drift. Men with strange accents and fancy surveying tools started appearing in the hollows. They were agents of the great northern corporations, geologists and timber scouts who saw something the local folk had taken for granted. They didn't see steep hillsides. They saw mountains of virgin hardwood. They didn't see rocky soil. They saw the richest seams of bituminous coal on God's green earth. The railroad, they promised, was coming. And with it would come a flood of money that would make the old ways of life seem like a dream. Suddenly, the prize wasn't just survival, it was a fortune. And the key to that fortune was locked inside a single building, the Hazard Courthouse. The men who held the offices of sheriff, county clerk, and judge didn't just keep records, they controlled the future. They oversaw the land deeds, they set the tax rates, and they enforced, or chose not to enforce, the law. Whichever clan controlled that courthouse would control who got rich and who got left behind when the coal boom hit. This was the forge. It took the old mountain code of honor and family loyalty and superheated it with the coming fire of industrial greed. Every election became a battle, every political dispute a potential vendetta. The stage was being set for a war, fought not by soldiers in uniform, but by neighbors and cousins. They weren't just fighting for power anymore. They were fighting for the soul of the mountains, and they were willing to turn their home into a killing ground to win it. Before the shooting started, you could still see the men for who they were, not just the leaders of warring armies. Take Joe Eversole. He wasn't some wild-eyed mountain brawler. He was a man who fought with words, a lawyer who could tie a man in knots with a well-phrased argument in the Hazard Courthouse. He'd sit with his family on his porch, not cleaning a rifle, but reading a newspaper from Lexington or Frankfurt, talking about the future. He spoke of railroads cutting through the mountains like steel rivers, of coal mines bringing payrolls and prosperity to families who had only ever known back-breaking farm work. His children would listen, and his wife would watch him, and they saw a man building a kingdom not of fear, but of progress. He was a Republican in a staunchly Democratic county, a man who saw the outside world not as a threat, but as an opportunity. He saw the coming corporations as partners, and he intended to be the man who brokered the deal. ensuring his family and his followers would be the first in line to reap the rewards. To his clan, Joe Eversole wasn't a warmonger. He was a visionary, the only man smart enough to guide them into the coming century. Then there was Benjamin Big Ben French. If Joe Eversole was the future, Big Ben was the living, breathing embodiment of the past. He was the sheriff, but his real power came from the sheer force of his presence. He was a massive man, built like one of the oak trees on his land, and his authority was absolute. He didn't need a law book. His word was law. On a Saturday afternoon, you'd find him on the steps of his store, a benevolent titan settling a land dispute between two farmers with a quiet word and a look that promised there would be no more argument. He was the patriarch of his clan in every sense of the word. He was surrounded by a web of kin who looked to him not just for leadership, but for protection. He was suspicious of the foreign money and the smooth-talking lawyers like Eversole. To Big Ben and his people, the coal under the ground wasn't a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder from Philadelphia. It was their birthright, part of the land their grandfathers had fought and bled for. Protecting that land and the old way of life it supported was his sacred duty. He was the wall that stood between his people and a changing world they did not trust. A man's greatest strength is often just the other side of the coin from his deadliest weakness. For Joe Eversole, his sharp, educated mind was his greatest asset, but it was also his blind spot. He saw the world as a chessboard, a place of logic and calculated risks. He believed the old mountain ways, the fierce pride, the stubborn loyalty to the past were simply obstacles to be outmaneuvered. He couldn't understand that in Perry County, honor wasn't a piece on a board. It was the board itself. He once publicly debated an old farmer loyal to the French clan, systematically tearing apart the man's fears about the railroad with facts and figures, and ending by calling his concerns ignorant sentiment. Joe won the argument, but he lost the room. He had shown contempt for their code, and in the mountains, contempt is a sin that demands a heavy price. Big Ben French, on the other hand, was ruled by a pride as massive as his own frame. It was the source of his power, the reason men would follow him into a fight without a second thought. But it was a rigid, unbending thing. For him, there was no such thing as a strategic retreat or a minor compromise. Every challenge, no matter how small, was a test of his authority that had to be met with overwhelming force. They tell a story of how a minor land dispute that could have been settled with a handshake and a jug of whiskey was instead escalated by French into a public standoff, simply because the other party was a distant cousin of the Eversoles. He wasn't just defending his land, he was defending his name, and he was willing to risk blood over it. This was the crack in each man's armor. Joe Eversole's ambition made him believe he was smarter than the old code, that he could push and prod and modernize without consequence. He saw Ben French not as a man to be respected, but as a stubborn relic to be swept aside by the march of progress. And Big Ben French's pride made it impossible for him to ignore a single one of those prods. He saw every move Joe Eversole made not as a political calculation, but as a direct, personal insult to his family and his way of life. One man could not stop pushing, and the other could not bend. Their flaws were perfectly matched, a lit fuse reaching for a barrel of gunpowder. It was no longer a question of if the county would explode, but when. The final break, the moment the bad blood turned to poison, didn't happen in a courtroom or a political debate. The legend says it happened where so many mountain feuds begin, over a bottle of whiskey and a game of cards. In 1886, in a smoke-filled room in Hazard, Joe Eversole and Ben French sat across from each other. The air was already thick with tension, but the liquor loosened their tongues and sharpened their contempt. A dispute over the game, a simple accusation of cheating or a misplayed hand, quickly spiraled. It was no longer about cards. It was about everything. Joe Eversole, with his lawyer's wit, made a sharp, condescending remark about the old ways, a jab at the French clan's stubborn resistance to progress. It was a flick of the wrist, but it landed like a fist on Big Ben French's jaw. For a man like French, whose entire world was built on the rock of his personal authority and the honor of his name, this public insult from a man he saw as an upstart was intolerable. His pride, that massive, unbending thing, ignited. He rose from his chair, his shadow swallowing Eversole, and the threats he made were not vague. They were promises, spoken low and cold, of what happens to men who forget their place. In the mountains, a public threat is a debt that must be paid. To let it pass is to admit you are the weaker man, and weakness is a death sentence. The line had been crossed. The room fell silent as the two men stared each other down, and everyone present knew they had just witnessed the conception of a war. Joe Eversole had poked the bear, believing his intelligence was shield enough. Ben French had been challenged in his own kingdom, and his pride demanded a brutal, unforgettable lesson. The lesson came a short time later, not in the open, but from the shadows. Nicholas "Nick" Combs was Joe Eversole's uncle, a trusted friend and a respected man in his own right. He was ambushed on a quiet mountain road, shot from his saddle without a chance to draw his own weapon. It was a cold, calculated act of terror. There was no trial, no witnesses came forward, but everyone in Perry County knew. This was the French clan's answer. It was a message written in blood, sent directly to Joe Eversole. For Joe, this was the moment the chessboard was kicked over. The murder of his uncle was not a political move. It was an act of savagery that ripped through his modern worldview. The old code he had tried to outsmart had just reached out and torn a hole in his family. His grief was matched only by a cold, burning rage. There would be no more debates, no more legal maneuvering. Ben French had chosen the language of the gun. Now, Joe Eversole would answer in kind. The affront had been delivered, and the only acceptable response was vengeance. The blood of Nick Combs was a seed, and from it a forest of rifles began to grow. Joe Eversole's grief was a cold, sharp thing, and it pointed him down a path from which there was no turning back. Now, you might think the mountain code would demand a simple, brutal balance, a life for a life. A French loyalist, maybe the man who pulled the trigger, would be found dead in a creek bed, and the scales of honor would be level once more. That was the old way. That was the path of compromise. Elders from both clans, men with grey in their beards who had seen enough killing in their time, tried to steer the currents back to that old channel. They came to Joe Eversole, not as enemies, but as neighbors. They spoke of the cost of a wider war, of fields that would go unplowed and children who would grow up without fathers. They pleaded with him to seek a targeted revenge, to let the matter end there before it consumed them all. They warned him that turning Perry County into a battlefield would only serve the interests of the outside coal men who were watching from the hills like vultures. But Joe Eversole was deaf to their warnings. His calculating mind, now fueled by rage, saw this as a moment of opportunity. A simple revenge killing would just continue the endless cycle. He wanted to end it, permanently. He didn't want to just balance the scales, he wanted to smash them. He rejected the pleas for peace, framing his decision not as vengeance, but as a crusade. He would raise an army, march on hazard, and tear the corrupt French regime out by its roots. He would bring, he claimed, a new kind of law to the mountains. It was the perfect justification, wrapping his raw ambition and his thirst for retribution in the noble flag of progress. Across the county, Ben French watched Eversole's mobilization, and his own pride provided the equal and opposite reaction. He heard the same pleas for peace, the same warnings, and he threw them back in the faces of those who offered them. To him, backing down now, offering a sacrifice to appease Eversole, would be an admission of guilt and a show of weakness he could not abide. He saw Eversole gathering men and buying rifles, and it confirmed his deepest suspicions. This was never about an uncle's death. It was a coup. So French began to prepare for a siege. He was the high sheriff, and he would turn the county seat into his personal fortress. He gathered his own loyalists, men who saw Eversole's progress as a threat to their very existence. He sent riders out, and the French clan answered the call. They barricaded windows in the courthouse and reinforced the doors of their homes. Each nail hammered into a board was another nail in the coffin of peace. Each new Winchester rifle that arrived in Hazard was another vote for war. The path of compromise was now completely overgrown, and the two factions were marching down separate parallel roads, destined to collide in the streets of the town they both claimed to be fighting for. On the night before the battle, a heavy silence fell over the hills around Hazard. It was a cold, clear November in 1887, and under a sky full of hard, distant stars, two armies lay waiting for the dawn. On the ridges outside of town, Joe Eversole's men huddled around small, smokeless fires, their Winchester rifles oiled and ready. Inside the town, Ben French's followers stood watch at the darkened windows of the courthouse, their own weapons loaded. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, knowing what the morning light would bring. Into this tense stillness, a single figure walked the lonely road between the two camps. It was an old circuit preacher, a man who belonged to no clan but God's. He had christened babies from both families and spoken the final words over their dead. He represented the last flickering candle flame of peace in a room reeking of gunpowder. He went first to Joe Eversole's camp. He found him staring into the darkness toward Hazard and made his plea, his voice low and urgent. He spoke not of politics, but of souls. He named the men on both sides who would be dead by the next sundown, men whose children he knew by name. "Is this the future you want to build, Joe?" he asked. "A county of widows and orphans?" For a moment, they say, Joe Eversole hesitated. He looked at the faces of his own men, young and old, farmers and loggers who had put their faith in him. He saw the terrible cost of his ambition laid bare. This was his final crossroads. He could call it off, accept the stalemate, and live with his uncle's death unavenged. But then he thought of Nick Combs lying dead on that lonely road, of Ben French's public insult, of the future he had promised his people. His fatal flaw, that cold, calculating logic, took over. To back down now would be to lose everything. He turned to the preacher and said, "Reverend, this isn't war. This is an extermination. The sickness is in that courthouse, and I am the cure." The old preacher then walked into the besieged town of Hazard, past French's armed sentries, and found Big Ben in the darkened sheriff's office. He made a different plea, an appeal to French's duty and his pride. "Ben," he said, "you are the sheriff. You are the law. Don't let your own town become a slaughterhouse. Show them you are the bigger man. Offer a truce." Ben French stood, a giant silhouette against the window, and looked out at the campfires of the Eversole army flickering on his hills like a disease. He too stood at a crossroads. He could offer a concession, perhaps hand over the man suspected of killing Nick Combs and spare the town. But his pride, that unbending mountain of a thing, would not allow it. To him, a truce was surrender. It was an admission that Joe Eversole had the right to march an army to his doorstep. He turned from the window, his face set like stone. "They are the ones who came for a war, Reverend," he said. "My only duty now is to see that they get one. You go and pray for their souls. I'll take care of their bodies." With those words, the final door to peace was slammed shut and bolted. The last chance was gone, burned away by the pride of two men who had chosen the path of no compromise. The dawn came up grey and cold over Hazard, and with the first weak light came the sound that would define Perry County for years to come. It wasn't a single shot, but a volley, a deafening, ripping roar as 100 Winchester rifles opened fire from the hills. The Battle of Hazard had begun. For the people of the town, cowering in their homes, it was as if the sky itself was being torn apart. The sound was everywhere, a physical force that rattled windows and shook the very floorboards. The morning birds fell silent, replaced by the high-pitched whine of ricochets and the sharp, splintering crack of bullets chewing through wooden walls. From the ridge, Joe Eversole watched his plan unfold. The world narrowed to the objective. The county courthouse, now a stone fortress spitting fire. His men moved like shadows, darting from the cover of one house to the next, their rifles barking in short, angry bursts. But for every man who moved, a dozen puffs of smoke would erupt from the courthouse and the surrounding buildings. The air grew thick and acrid with the smell of burnt black powder. This wasn't the swift, surgical strike he had envisioned. This was a meat grinder. The logic and planning that had brought him here felt useless against the sheer, stubborn reality of stone walls and determined men. Inside that courthouse, Big Ben French was no longer a sheriff. He was a general in a siege. The cavernous rooms echoed with the thunder of his own men's rifles. The air was a haze of smoke, and the constant thud of Eversole's bullets against the thick stone walls was a drumbeat of impending doom. He would move from window to window, his massive frame a silhouette against the flashes of gunfire, directing his kin with a quiet word or a nod. His world was reduced to what he could see through those narrow, deadly rectangles of glass, the street below, where men he had known his whole life were now trying to end his. He felt the weight of his unbending pride, not as a burden, but as the foundation holding the building up. For the families of Hazard, the war was a terrifying, unseen monster living on the floor above them. Huddled in their root cellars, they could only listen. They heard the frantic running of booted feet on the boardwalks, the desperate shouted commands, and the ceaseless, terrifying percussion of the rifles. A woman clutched her children as the jars of canned beans on the shelf rattled from the concussions overhead. An old man pressed his ear to the dirt floor, trying to discern the sounds of friend from foe. The battle wasn't just in the streets, it was in their homes, a violation so profound it would leave a scar on their memory forever. For 2 full days, the town was a war zone. The fighting would lull, creating a tense, ringing silence where the only sound was a dog barking in the distance, and then it would erupt again in a furious crescendo of violence. A man who rose from behind a stone wall to take a shot might suddenly disappear from view. A figure running across an open street would stumble and lie still. The argument that had begun over a card table was now being settled with lead, and its costs were written in the still forms that dotted the muddy streets. Finally, as the second day bled into a weary dusk, the firing from the hills began to slacken. Joe Eversole had to accept the truth. The courthouse would not fall. His army, battered and low on ammunition, began to melt back into the mountains from which it had come. The retreat was slow, sullen, and bitter. A great, profound silence descended upon Hazard, a silence that felt heavier and more menacing than the noise it replaced. The smoke slowly cleared, revealing a town that looked like it had been savaged by a great beast. Windows were shattered, doors were splintered, and the courthouse stood defiant, pockmarked but unbroken. The Battle of Hazard was over, but the war had just begun. No ground had been gained, no decisive victory won. But a terrible line had been crossed. The men of Perry County had proven they were willing to turn their own home into a battlefield. They had fired on their neighbors, their cousins, their kin. The courthouse still belonged to Ben French, but the town and the soul of the county now belonged to the Feud. As the last shots faded, Joe Eversole's grand army was gone. It had dissolved, melting back into the hollows like a dirty spring snow. The retreat was a grim, silent affair. There was no order given, just a shared, unspoken understanding that the battle was lost. Men carried their wounded on makeshift litters, their faces grim with exhaustion and defeat. Joe Eversole rode with them, his visionary's fire banked to a cold, hard ember of humiliation. He had promised his people a swift victory, a new order. Instead, he had led them into a bloody stalemate and left his dead in the streets of Hazard. In the cold twilight of the mountains, he could feel the weight of his failure and the burning need for a different kind of war. The road of the open soldier had ended. The path of the assassin was just beginning. Back in Hazard, Ben French walked out of the pockmarked courthouse into the ruins of his town. He was the victor, but there was no triumph in his eyes. He stood on the steps and surveyed the damage. The sour smell of gunpowder and fresh splintered pine hung heavy in the air. A dead horse lay in the street, and further down, a shape under a blanket told a story he didn't need to hear. Doors creaked open, and the faces of the townspeople peered out, their eyes full of a new kind of fear. They weren't looking at a sheriff who had saved them, but at a warlord who had made their home a battlefield. He walked the muddy streets, his boots crunching on shattered glass. He saw the bullet holes that stitched across the front of the general store, the gouges in the church steeple. He had held his ground. He had beaten back the usurper. His pride was intact. But the cost was written on every building, on every frightened face. This victory tasted like ash and gunpowder. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was not the end. Joe Eversole would not simply accept this defeat. The war would not be fought with armies anymore. It would be fought in the dark, on lonely roads, with a single shot from a hidden rifle. He had won the battle, but in doing so, he had sentenced his county and himself to a long, slow bleed. The road hadn't ended. It had just become a darker and more treacherous path for everyone. The silence that followed the Battle of Hazard wasn't peace. It was the sound of a held breath. The Eversole army had retreated, but the war had spread, seeping like a fever into every cabin and hollow in Perry County. Before the battle, you could be a man who was friendly with both sides. After, there was no middle ground. The fighting had drawn a line of blood and gunpowder through the heart of the community, and every single person was now forced to stand on one side or the other. A nod that wasn't returned, a glance held a second too long. These were now potential death sentences. You have to understand what this did to the people. The feud was now a poison in the well water, and everyone had to drink. Men who had hunted together since they were boys now watched each other through the sights of a rifle. Corn rotted on the stalk because the man who planted it was afraid to walk his own fields without a guard. Travel on the county roads, once a simple trip to the grist mill, became a deadly gamble. Every rustle in the trees, every shadow that fell across the path, could be an ambush. The doors that had always been open to neighbors were now barred at night, and men slept with their Winchesters not just by their beds, but in them. And the wreckage wasn't just measured in the dead. Think of the families left behind. For the wife of a man killed in the fighting, his death was just the beginning. Her grief was compounded by shame, by the poverty that followed, and by the terrible knowledge that her sons were now expected to inherit their father's rifle and his list of enemies. The war wasn't just killing the men of Perry County. It was mortgaging the souls of their children, baptizing them in a legacy of hatred that they had no part in creating. The community, that fragile web of trust and mutual support that allows life to function in such an isolated place, was shredded. Friendships that had spanned generations were severed overnight. Business partnerships dissolved into bitter accusations. Even church on Sunday became a tense affair, with French loyalists sitting on one side of the aisle and Eversole sympathizers on the other, the preacher's words about forgiveness falling like seeds on barren stone. The feud had become a cancer, and it was eating the county alive from the inside out. The tragedy no longer belonged to Joe Eversole or Ben French. It now belonged to everyone. The murder of a judge on the courthouse steps was an act of blasphemy against the state. It was a message sent in powder and lead that the feudists believed their law was the only law that mattered. They were wrong. The news of Judge Josiah Combs' assassination reached the governor's mansion in Frankfurt, and the reaction was swift and furious. Governor Simon Bolivar Buckner was an old soldier, and he saw this not as a crime, but as an insurrection. He sent the state militia back into Perry County, but this time their orders were different. They weren't there to keep the peace. They were there to hunt. The state put a price on the head of the man everyone believed was the killer, Bad Tom Smith. And his trial, when they finally captured him, was a spectacle. It was more than the trial of one man. It was the trial of the mountain code itself, put in the dock to be judged by the outside world. Imagine the scene. A formal courtroom, with a judge in a black robe, lawyers with stacks of books and witnesses sworn in on a Bible. And in the defendant's chair sat Tom Smith, a man whose entire life had been governed by a different Bible, the simple, brutal creed of loyalty and retribution. The clash of cultures was palpable. The prosecution built its case with evidence, timelines, and legal arguments. They spoke of malice aforethought and conspiracy to commit murder. But the testimony from the mountain folk spoke a different language. They talked of who was kin to whom, of old insults, of debts of honor that had to be paid. The state's lawyers asked, "Did you see the defendant break the law of Kentucky?" But the silent question in the eyes of the local people was, did he betray his clan? Was he a loyal soldier? The court was trying to prove a crime. The feudists were trying to understand a move in their war. The community was torn in two. To the Eversoles and their allies, and to the growing number of people simply sick of the bloodshed, Tom Smith was a monster, the devil himself, and the trial was long overdue justice. They saw the law as a savior, the only force strong enough to break the cycle of killing. But to the French faction and those who clung to the old ways, he was a soldier captured by a foreign power. They saw him as a scapegoat, a man taking the fall for a war that everyone had a hand in. To them, the trial was a sham, an act of conquest by the state government in Frankfurt, which had never cared about their lives until a man wearing one of its robes was killed. He was a criminal to the state, but a martyr to his cause. The verdict was never truly in doubt. The state of Kentucky had to make an example of bad Tom Smith. It had to prove that its authority was absolute, that its law reached into the deepest, darkest hollows, and that it was stronger than any clan's code of honor. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang. Was it justice? For the family of Judge Combs, yes, but for Perry County, it was something else entirely. It was a declaration. The old world was over. The state was here to stay, and its judgment didn't come from a quiet word between patriarchs. It came at the end of a rope. You might think the story ends there, with the snap of a rope and the fall of the feud's most fearsome soldier. You might think justice, however brutal, had finally tidied up the mess in Perry County. But the truth of the mountains is never that clean. The law that had been so absolute with a hired gun like Tom Smith suddenly became very flexible when it came to the powerful men who had started the war. What became of Big Ben French, the patriarch who had turned the courthouse into his personal fortress? He was indicted, yes, but the charges were eventually dropped in a quiet political truce. There was no grand trial for him, no final judgment. The state, having made its point by hanging Tom Smith, seemed to lose its appetite for the fight. But Ben French didn't win. He had watched his world burn, his power broken not by Joe Eversole's army, but by the chaos they had mutually created. The fire in him simply went out. He lived out his days a diminished figure, a ghost in his own county, a relic of an age that had ended in blood and smoke. And Joe Eversole, the man of progress who had unleashed the storm, he seemed to have won. His chief rival was broken, and the state had crushed the heart of the French faction's enforcers. A few years after the war sputtered out, he was living in Virginia, a successful man who had seemingly escaped the consequences of his own bloody ambition. But the mountain code he had tried to outmaneuver had a longer reach than he ever imagined. The feud found him. He was assassinated, shot down far from the Kentucky hills, a final bloody postscript proving that the hatred he had helped create was a debt that would eventually be paid in full. But the true antagonists, the ones who had provoked the entire conflict without ever firing a shot, faced no consequences at all. While the French and Eversole clans were busy digging graves for their sons, the agents of the Northern Coal and Timber Corporations were busy drawing lines on maps. They had watched patiently as the local leadership bled each other dry. In the ruin and poverty that followed the war, they swept in. They bought up the mineral rights and the land titles for pennies on the dollar from the very widows and broken men the feud had created. The clans had fought a savage war for control of the kingdom, and in the process they had burned the kingdom to the ground, leaving the keys to the ashes for the quiet men in suits to come and pick them up. The killing stopped, But the war wasn't over. It just went on inside the people, a quiet, smoldering fire passed down from one generation to the next. To be an Eversole or a French in Perry County after the war was to carry a ghost on your back. For decades, the names themselves were like a brand, marking you as part of a story that everyone knew but no one wanted to tell. Some descendants fled the mountains entirely, changing their names and trying to outrun the bloody shadow of their past. Others stayed, living under a constant weight of expectation or suspicion, forever defined by the actions of a grandfather they had never even met. The community healed itself in the only way it knew how, by burying the memory alive. A deep and profound silence fell over the history of the feud. It became the great, unspoken trouble. Men who had shot at each other in the streets of Hazard now passed each other at the general store with a quiet, stiff nod. They had to. To survive, they had to pretend it never happened. But the ghost of it was always there. At weddings, people would watch to see which families sat on which side of the church. At funerals, they would remember how the deceased's father had died. The war became a part of the landscape, an invisible mountain that everyone had to live under. And into the vacuum of power left by the shattered clans, a new king came to the mountains. This king didn't carry a rifle. It carried a ledger book and a surveyor's chain. The coal companies, the patient vultures who had watched the battle from afar, now descended. With the old patriarchal system broken, there was no one left with the power to resist them. The Hazard Courthouse, the very building the clans had bled for, slowly became just another office for processing the company's land deeds and enforcing its will. The new sheriff wasn't the head of a clan. He was a man who understood his main job was to protect the company payroll and break up union talk. The final bitter legacy of the Perry County War was written on the faces of the next generation. The sons of the men who had fought and died for control of the mountains didn't inherit a kingdom. They inherited a job. They traded their rifles for pickaxes and went to work for the same foreign corporations their fathers had either courted or resisted. They swapped their fierce, violent independence for a company paycheck, a house in a company town, and a debt at the company store. The war for the soul of Perry County was finally over, and the soul had been sold for a train car full of coal. If you go to Hazard today, you won't find the same courthouse that Ben French defended. It's been replaced by a more modern building. But you can stand on the very spot where Judge Josiah Combs fell, the threshold of justice where the feud reached its bloody climax. And if you know where to look, out in the old family cemeteries tucked away in the hollows, you can find the graves. You can run your hand over the weathered tombstones of Eversoles and Frenches, their names and dates being slowly erased by a century of wind and rain. These stones are the last physical witnesses, the silent, moss-covered proof that these men lived and fought and died here. But the memory of the war doesn't live in the stone. It lives in the stories. And no name from that time echoes with more chilling power than Bad Tom Smith. He has become more than a man. He's the boogeyman of Perry County. For generations, his story was a cautionary tale told to children on dark nights. His supposed pact with the devil, his cold, dead eyes, and most of all, his final defiant words from the gallows, "Hell is my destination, and I'm not afraid to go," have transformed him from a historical figure into a genuine folk legend. He is the ghost of the feud made flesh, a permanent reminder of how dark a man's soul can get. The war itself has become a ballad, sung not with music, but in the quiet conversations on front porches and in the back of old country stores. It's a story told to explain why things are the way they are. It's a warning about what happens when pride is allowed to run hotter than reason, a lesson in how neighbors can tear each other apart over a prize, only to let a silent stranger walk away with it in the end. It's the foundational myth of modern Perry County, the bloody birth of the coal camp world that would follow. And the ghost of a name is more than just a memory. The names are still there. You can find French and Eversole and Combs in the phone book today. The descendants of these men are now neighbors. Their children go to the same schools, and they live in a world that was built on the ashes of their ancestors' war. The feud is over, buried under layers of silence and time. But the spirit of it, that fierce, stubborn mountain pride, that deep suspicion of outsiders, that lingering memory of a time when a man's honor was worth more than his life, that hasn't vanished. It still haunts these hills, an echo that has never truly faded away. So we come to the end of the road, and the question we started with still hangs in the air. Was Joe Eversole a hero or a villain? Was Ben French a protector or a tyrant? The truth, as it so often does in these mountains, lies in the muddy grey between. Eversole was a visionary who saw the future, but his ambition was so great he was willing to pave the road to it with the bodies of his neighbors. French was a patriarch defending his people, but his pride was so rigid he would rather see his kingdom burn than bend an inch. They were not good men or bad men. They were hard men, forged by a hard place, and their flaws were the sparks that lit the world on fire. In the end, this isn't just a story about a feud. It is a timeless, brutal lesson in how a man's greatest strength can become his most profound weakness. Ben French's unshakable honor was the bedrock of his power until it became a stone that drowned him. Joe Eversole's sharp, modern mind was his greatest weapon until it blinded him to the ancient, bloody truths of the human heart. They were two sides of the same coin, destined to destroy each other, and in their destruction, they cleared the path for the very forces they were fighting to control. The Perry County War stands as a dark monument in the heart of Appalachia. It's a story of how a community can be led to tear its own heart out, fighting a savage war for control of a prize, only to wake up from the slaughter and find that a silent, patient stranger has walked away with it all. The clans fought for the land, but the corporations got the coal. And that, my friends, is the Ballad of the Perry County War, a story of how mountain men fought like kings for a kingdom, and in the end, lost everything but their graves.